What happens when the world's most ruthless billionaire CEO wakes up in a suburban guest room, wearing nothing but her employee's oversized flannel shirt? It wasn't a scandalous romance. It was the night a $50 million corporate sabotage framed a single father, turning his quiet life into a living nightmare. Thomas Hayes did not belong at the Waldorf Astoria, and his rented tuxedo was a stark, uncomfortable reminder of that fact. As a senior risk analyst for Kensington Global Holdings, he was used to existing in the background, a silent architect of financial safety nets. He was a 34-year-old widower, drowning in the medical debt his late wife had left behind, just trying to keep a roof over the head of his 6-year-old daughter, Lily. He wasn't a power player, he was a survivor. Yet, attendance at the annual Kensington Winter Gala was mandatory for senior staff. Across the cavernous chandelier-lit ballroom stood Victoria Kensington. At 32, she was the undisputed sovereign of the company she had inherited from her father. She was brilliant, unyielding, and notoriously cold. Tonight, draped in an emerald silk gown that probably cost more than Thomas's car, she was holding court. But to Thomas's trained, analytical eye, something was deeply wrong. Victoria wasn't dominating the conversation. She was swaying. Thomas watched from the periphery, sipping a club soda. He noticed Gregory Patterson, the company's ambitious chief operating officer, standing entirely too close to her. Patterson had been pushing a hostile restructuring plan for months, a plan Victoria vehemently opposed. Beside Patterson was Nathaniel Brooks, a hedge fund manager with a reputation as slimy as his slicked-back hair. The two men exchanged a subtle, knowing glance. Victoria abruptly set her champagne flute on a passing waiter's tray, her hand trembling. She murmured something to Patterson, turned, and walked toward the discreet service hallway near the kitchens. Her steps were uneven, a stark contrast to her usual commanding stride. Thomas felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The corporate world was cutthroat, but this felt predatory. Setting his drink down, he quietly followed her path. The service hallway was a stark departure from the gilded ballroom, lined with stainless steel carts and fluorescent lighting. Thomas found Victoria leaning heavily against the wall near the loading dock exit, clutching her head. Her face was pale, glistening with a cold sweat. "Miss Kensington?" Thomas asked softly, stepping forward. She flinched, her eyes unfocused as she looked at him. "Who are you?" Her words were slurred. "Thomas Hayes, Risk Management. Are you all right? Let me call your driver." "Jenkins," she mumbled, her knees buckling. Thomas caught her before she hit the concrete floor. "Jenkins isn't answering. Phone's gone." Before Thomas could pull out his own phone, the heavy metal door of the ballroom pushed open. Nathaniel Brooks stepped into the hallway, a predatory smirk plastered on his face. "There you are, Victoria. You slipped away." "Don't worry, Hayes," Brooks said, his tone dismissive. "I'll take it from here. I'm taking her home." Thomas looked at Brooks, then down at the semi-conscious billionaire gripping his rented jacket like a lifeline. He didn't know Brooks well, but he knew the rumors. More importantly, he knew a compromised asset when he saw one. "That won't be necessary, Mr. Brooks," Thomas said, his voice remarkably steady. "Miss Kensington already instructed me to handle her transport. I'm her designated security liaison for the evening." It was a complete fabrication, but spoken with enough authority, it made Brooks pause. Brooks narrowed his eyes. "I don't think you know who you're dealing with, risk analyst. I know I'm calling hotel security in about 3 seconds if you don't step back," Thomas countered, shifting his weight. Brooks sneered, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Suit yourself. She's going to ruin you by tomorrow morning anyway." He turned and stalked back into the ballroom. Thomas half-carried, half-dragged Victoria out the loading dock doors into the freezing December rain. He managed to hail a passing yellow cab, opting not to use the ride-sharing apps that tracked locations. "Where to, pal?" the driver asked. "Upper East Side, the Sovereign Building," Thomas said, rattling off Victoria's well-known luxury address. In the back seat, Victoria was barely coherent. She was shivering violently, muttering disjointed phrases. "Patterson, the Cayman Files. Don't let them in." As the cab pulled onto her street, Thomas saw them. Two black SUVs were illegally parked right in front of the building's gilded entrance. More concerning were the four men with cameras slung around their necks, loitering under the awning despite the rain. Paparazzi. And they looked like they were waiting for a specific target. If Victoria got out of the cab in this state, her career would be over by sunrise. The board would deem her unfit, and Patterson would seize control. Someone had orchestrated this perfectly. Her drink was spiked, her phone was stolen, her driver was neutralized, and the press was tipped off. "Keep driving," Thomas barked at the cabbie. "Take the Lincoln Tunnel. We're going to New Jersey." An hour later, Thomas was unlocking the door to his modest two-bedroom home in Maplewood. He paid the driver a massive tip to keep quiet and practically carried Victoria inside. The contrast between her emerald gown and his fading living room furniture was jarring. He managed to get her into the guest room. She immediately stumbled to the adjoining bathroom and violently threw up. Thomas stood by awkwardly, handing her a wet washcloth. Her dress was ruined, soaked in rain and sick. She couldn't sleep in it. Keeping his eyes strictly averted, Thomas found a clean, oversized blue flannel shirt in his closet. He left it on the edge of the bathtub. "Take the dress off, Miss Kensington. Put this on. You're safe here." He closed the door, listened to her fumble with the fabric, and waited until she collapsed onto the guest bed. Thomas spent the rest of the night wide awake on his lumpy sofa, a baseball bat resting by his knees, wondering how he was going to explain this to the most powerful woman he knew. The smell of burnt toast and cheap coffee was what finally pulled Victoria Kensington from the dark, suffocating abyss of her drug-induced sleep. She opened her eyes, immediately blinding herself against the harsh morning sunlight, filtering through cheap plastic blinds. Her head pounded with the force of a jackhammer. She tried to sit up, groaning as the room spun. This wasn't her penthouse. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her hangover. The walls were painted a dull beige. There was a framed poster of the solar system on the wall, and the bedspread was a faded, patchwork quilt. She looked down at herself. She was wearing a worn, excessively large blue flannel shirt that smelled faintly of cedar and laundry detergent. Underneath it, she was in nothing but her undergarments. Her breath hitched. The memories of the previous night were shattered fragments. The gala, the sudden, overwhelming dizziness, the terrifying realization that she was losing control of her body, and Patterson's grinning face. Then, a dark alley, a man's voice, a cab ride in the rain. Had she been kidnapped? Assaulted? Framed? Victoria swung her bare feet onto the hardwood floor, her survival instincts overriding her physical pain. She grabbed a heavy ceramic lamp off the nightstand, wielding it like a club, and crept toward the bedroom door. She cracked it open. The hallway led to a small, cluttered kitchen. Standing at the stove, wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, was Thomas Hayes. He was currently attempting to scrape a burnt pancake out of a frying pan. Sitting at the small dining table, kicking her legs, was a little girl with chaotic pigtails, aggressively coloring a picture of a dinosaur. Victoria stood frozen in the doorway, the lamp still raised. Thomas glanced up and froze. "Miss Kensington," he said cautiously, setting the spatula down. "Please don't hit me with the lamp. It was my mother's." Victoria lowered the weapon slightly, her mind racing. "Hayes? Thomas Hayes from Risk Assessment?" "Yes, ma'am." "Where am I? Why am I wearing this? What happened to me?" Her voice was laced with an icy fury that usually sent executives running, but Thomas just sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're in my house, in Maplewood, New Jersey. Your dress was covered in vomit, so I left my shirt in the bathroom for you to change into. I slept on the couch." Thomas pointed to the living room, where a crumpled blanket lay on the sofa. "As for what happened, I believe someone drugged you at the gala." The little girl at the table suddenly looked up, her wide blue eyes fixing on Victoria. "Daddy, is she a princess? She looks like a messy princess." The absolute absurdity of the situation momentarily derailed Victoria's panic. "I am not a princess," she snapped, perhaps harsher than intended. Lily didn't flinch. She just picked up a green crayon. "You sound like the angry queen from my movie." "Lily, Eat your breakfast, Thomas gently scolded. He poured a cup of black coffee and set it on the counter. Drink this, Miss Kensington. I know you have a lot of questions, but first, I need you to understand that I brought you here because there were paparazzi swarming your building. Someone set a trap for you. Victoria slowly walked to the counter, abandoning the lamp. She gripped the warm mug, her brilliant mind piecing the fragments together. If her drink was spiked, Patterson was undoubtedly behind it. If she had been caught, blacked out on camera, or worse, found in a hotel room with Nathaniel Brooks. My phone, she demanded, her voice tight. I need my phone. I found it in the pocket of your dress this morning. The battery was dead. I plugged it in. Thomas slid her sleek, black smartphone across the counter. Victoria powered it on. The screen lit up, instantly flooding with notifications. 47 missed calls, over 100 urgent emails. She ignored all of them and dialed the private number of Jonathan Miller, her fiercely loyal chief financial officer. He answered on the first ring. Victoria. Thank God. Where the hell are you? Jonathan's voice was borderline hysterical. I'm safe, Jonathan. What's the situation? Patterson tried to poison me. Victoria, it's worse than that, Jonathan said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. We have a catastrophic breach. At 2 a.m. last night, while you were entirely off the grid, your private digital signature authorized a massive transfer from the corporate R&D accounts, $50 million. Victoria gripped the edge of the cheap laminate counter so hard her knuckles turned white. That's impossible. My signature requires dual biometric authentication and a randomized token. I was unconscious. The money was routed through a dozen shell companies before landing in a blind trust in Geneva, Jonathan continued, sounding sick. But here is the killing blow, Victoria. Our cyber team tracked the IP address of the authorization. It didn't come from a hacker. It came from the secure server inside your penthouse. The coffee mug in Victoria's hand rattled against the counter. Patterson called an emergency board meeting for 10 a.m. Jonathan rushed on. He's claiming you've embezzled company funds to sink the company, so his restructuring plan fails. If you don't show up with proof that you didn't make that transfer, they're going to vote you out, seize your shares, and call the FBI. Jonathan, listen to me. I wasn't at my penthouse. I haven't been there all night. Can you prove that? Jonathan asked desperately. Do you have an alibi? Someone who can swear on record that you were nowhere near your computer at 2 a.m.? Victoria slowly looked up from the phone. Her eyes locked onto Thomas, who was quietly wiping milk off the kitchen table, while his daughter happily chewed on a burnt pancake. She was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire. Thomas was a widowed mid-level analyst, making $80,000 a year. He was her only alibi. But to use him meant admitting she spent the night at his house, in his clothes, a PR nightmare that Patterson would twist into a scandalous affair, ruining both of their reputations. Worse, it would put a massive, dangerous target squarely on Thomas's back. Whoever had bypassed her penthouse security wouldn't hesitate to silence a risk analyst from New Jersey. Victoria? Jonathan's voice crackled through the speaker. Do you have an alibi? Victoria stared at the man who had given up his bed and risked his job to save her life. Yes, she finally said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal register. I have an alibi, but we're going to have to play dirty to use him. The silence in Thomas's small kitchen was deafening after the call ended. Victoria stared at the cheap linoleum floor, her mind operating at 1,000,000 miles an hour, processing the betrayal. $50 million. It wasn't just theft. It was a perfectly orchestrated assassination of her character and her legacy. Thomas watched her, his analytical brain doing what it did best, assessing the risk. If you use me as your alibi, he said slowly, breaking the silence, Patterson will spin it. He'll say, we are having an illicit affair, that you fled to my house to hide the digital tracks of your embezzlement. He owns half the financial press. They'll print whatever narrative he hands them. He doesn't just own the press, Hayes. He owns the board, Victoria replied, her voice dangerously calm. She finally looked up from the floor, her eyes locking onto his. If I walk into that 10 a.m. meeting and simply say I was here, they'll demand proof. Then they'll demand my resignation to save the company's stock price from the scandal. We need more than an alibi. We need the weapon he used to frame me. The IP address, Thomas said, moving to the counter and opening his laptop, a heavy, outdated machine that whirred loudly as it booted up. Jonathan said the transfer was authorized from your penthouse server. Your network is air-gapped from the main Kensington mainframe. To execute a transfer of that magnitude, someone needed physical access to your router, or they cloned your biometric token. Victoria's eyes narrowed. My token. It's a custom RFID keycard synced to my fingerprint. It never leaves my clutch. Where is your clutch? Thomas asked. Victoria pointed to the living room, where her ruined emerald gown lay in a heap on an armchair. Beside it sat a small silver designer handbag. Thomas walked over, grabbed the clutch, and brought it back to the kitchen table. He tipped it upside down. A tube of lipstick, a compact, and her keys fell out. No RFID card. They took it, Victoria whispered, the realization washing over her. When did they take it? I was surrounded by people. Wait, Thomas said, pulling up a chair and gesturing for her to sit beside him. He opened a secure portal on his laptop, bypassing the standard employee login to access the raw data streams of the corporate risk department. Let's retrace the timeline. When did you start feeling dizzy? Victoria closed her eyes, visualizing the gala. Around 9:30 p.m., I was speaking with Senator Hastings. Then Patterson's executive assistant, Chloe, bumped into me. She spilled a tray of champagne glasses. It was a massive commotion. Classic misdirection, Thomas muttered, his fingers flying across the keyboard. She bumps into you, creates chaos, and lifts the card from your open clutch. By 9:45 p.m., you were drugged, and I was pulling you out of the service hallway. But how did they bypass the biometric lock on the card? Victoria asked, leaning closer to the screen. They didn't need your fingerprint if they had someone on the inside of Kensington's IT department who could disable the secondary authentication protocol, Thomas explained, pulling up the server access logs for the previous night. Look at this. At 1:15 a.m., an IT administrator named Arthur Pendleton logged into the Central Security mainframe. He initiated a temporary override on your specific RFID serial number, claiming it was a scheduled firmware update. Pendleton, Victoria hissed. He's Patterson's brother-in-law. I refused to promote him last year because he failed a basic phishing test. Nepotism is a wonderful trail to follow, Thomas said grimly. With the override in place, Patterson didn't even need to be in your penthouse. He used a VPN bouncer to spoof your home IP address, plugged the stolen card into a dummy reader, and transferred the $50 million to Geneva while you were throwing up in my guest bathroom. We have the proof, Victoria said, a vicious, triumphant smile playing on her lips. We have the logs. We have breadcrumbs, Thomas corrected, closing the laptop. These logs show an anomaly, but Patterson will claim your computer was hacked. To bury him, we need to prove he physically possesses the stolen money, or at least prove the exact location the transfer actually originated from. And we need to do it in exactly 2 hours. Victoria glanced at the wall clock. 8 a.m. Then we need to move. But I can't exactly walk into a corporate war room smelling of cheap tequila and wearing a flannel shirt. Thomas looked her up and down. She was right. The paparazzi would have a field day before she even reached the elevator banks. There's a strip mall 10 minutes from here. I'll go buy you something. What's your size? Prada or Armani? She asked instinctively. Thomas let out a short, humorless laugh. Target. This is Maplewood, Miss Kensington. I can get you a polyester blazer and some slacks. 20 minutes later, Thomas returned with a generic gray pantsuit, a crisp white button-down, and a pair of basic black flats. Victoria changed in the guest room, staring at herself in the cheap, full-length mirror. The suit was stiff, the tailoring was non-existent, and she looked like a mid-level regional manager. But as she pulled her blonde hair back into a severe, unforgiving bun, the ruthless CEO returned. "Daddy, Lily said, tugging on Thomas's pant leg as Victoria emerged from the hallway. The princess looks like my teacher now. Your teacher is a very respectable professional, Lily, Victoria said smoothly, adjusting the stiff lapels. She turned to Thomas. Call your neighbor, the one with the security camera facing your driveway. I need that footage from last night. It's the cornerstone of our defense. Thomas nodded, already dialing his neighbor, Mrs. Gable. Within 5 minutes, he had the video file forwarded to his phone. The black and white infrared footage clearly showed Thomas dragging a completely incapacitated Victoria out of a yellow cab and up his front steps at 11:42 p.m. It's not flattering, Thomas noted, showing her the screen. You look like a corpse. It's perfect, Victoria countered. It's irrefutable proof that I was unconscious and miles away from my penthouse when the transfer happened at 2 a.m. Are you ready for the fallout? Thomas asked, grabbing his coat. Once we play this card, my quiet life is over. The press will dig into my past, my wife's medical debts, my daughter. Victoria stopped at the front door and turned to him. The cold corporate exterior softened just for a fraction of a second. Thomas, if we pull this off, you won't have to worry about medical debts ever again. You saved my life last night. Today, I'm saving yours. Let's go hunting. The atmosphere in the Kensington Global Holdings boardroom was suffocating. The massive mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the tense faces of the company's 12 board members. At the head of the table, where Victoria usually sat, stood Gregory Patterson. He looked the part of a savior perfectly. His bespoke navy suit was immaculate, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his expression was crafted into a mask of deep, paternal sorrow. Seated to his right was Nathaniel Brooks, the hedge fund manager, casually checking his gold Rolex. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, Patterson began, his voice echoing in the cavernous room overlooking the Manhattan skyline. It brings me no joy to call this emergency session. As you are all aware, Victoria Kensington has been acting erratically for months, violently opposing necessary structural changes to secure our financial future. He activated a remote, and a massive screen behind him illuminated, displaying a stark, terrifying graphic. A bank transfer receipt for $50 million, routed to a numbered Swiss account. At 2 a.m. last night, Victoria liquidated our primary offshore R&D fund, Patterson continued, feigning grief. The transfer was initiated from the private secure server inside her penthouse, using her personal biometric RFID token. She has stolen from us, presumably to fund a golden parachute, before the SEC investigates her mismanagement. She has gone dark, her phone is off, and her security detail cannot locate her. Murmurs of panic rippled through the older board members. Jonathan Miller, the CFO, sat sweating at the far end of the table, desperately texting Victoria's number, praying for a miracle. I propose an immediate vote of no confidence, Patterson declared, placing his hands flat on the table. We must strip Victoria of her executive powers, freeze her remaining shares, and contact the federal authorities. I am prepared to step in as interim CEO to guide us through this crisis. I second the motion, Nathaniel Brooks drawled, a smirk playing on his lips. You're voting on a fairy tale, Gregory. A sharp, icy voice rang out. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. The room fell dead silent. Victoria Kensington strode in. The board members gasped, not just because she was there, but because of how she looked. Gone was the couture and the diamond jewelry. She wore a cheap, stiff gray suit from a suburban strip mall, yet she wore it like armor. She radiated a lethal authority that made the air in the room drop 10 degrees. Right behind her, looking distinctly out of place but standing tall, was Thomas Hayes. Patterson's smug expression faltered, the color draining slightly from his cheeks. Victoria, we thought you had fled. Fled? Victoria laughed, a harsh, cutting sound. She walked purposefully toward the head of the table, forcing Patterson to step back or be run over. Why would I flee my own company, Gregory? Because of a fabricated bank transfer you orchestrated. Fabricated? Brooks scoffed, leaning forward. The IP logs don't lie, Victoria. Your personal server authorized the transfer. Your digital fingerprints are all over the gun. Actually, Mr. Brooks, the logs lie exceptionally well when they are manipulated by an insider, Thomas said, stepping forward. He pulled a small flash drive from his pocket and plugged it into the console on the table. He didn't wait for permission. He mirrored his laptop screen to the main projector, replacing Patterson's damning graphic. "Who is this man?" an elderly board member demanded. "Thomas Hayes, senior risk analyst," Victoria answered, "and my alibi." The screen flickered, and the infrared security footage from Thomas's neighbor began to play. The board watched in stunned silence as Thomas dragged a limp, unconscious Victoria out of the cab. The timestamp in the corner blinked bright red, 11:42 p.m., Maplewood, New Jersey. "As you can see," Victoria said, her voice dripping with venom, "I was violently incapacitated, drugged, to be precise, at our own gala. Mr. Hayes, recognizing the danger, pulled me out of the building and took me to his home to ensure my safety. I was unconscious in his guest room from 11:30 p.m. until 7 a.m. this morning." Patterson swallowed hard, a bead of sweat forming on his temple. "This proves nothing. You could have set a delayed script to initiate the transfer while you were away, to create this exact alibi. A delayed script requires a pre-authorization of the RFID token, which expires every 30 minutes, Thomas countered seamlessly, slipping into his element. He clicked to the next slide. A live token was required at 2 a.m. But Miss Kensington didn't have her token. It was stolen from her clutch at 9:30 p.m. by your assistant, Chloe. "Slander!" Patterson shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "You have no proof of that." "We don't need proof of the theft, Gregory," Victoria said softly, leaning over the table, her eyes locked onto his like a predator observing trapped prey. "Because Thomas found proof of the override." Thomas pulled up the IT mainframe logs. At 1:15 a.m., Arthur Pendleton, Mr. Patterson's brother-in-law, used his administrative privileges to bypass the biometric requirement for Miss Kensington's token. He then spoofed the penthouse IP address. "But here is where you got sloppy, Gregory," Victoria interjected, taking over the presentation. She tapped the screen, pulling up a highly complex web of network routing protocols. "You assumed spoofing my IP would be enough. But Kensington Holdings recently updated its risk management software, an update spearheaded by Mr. Hayes. It logs not just the IP, but the physical MAC address of the hardware executing the command." Thomas clicked one final button. The MAC address that initiated the $50 million transfer didn't originate from the penthouse router. It originated from a private server farm in Stamford, Connecticut. Thomas turned to look directly at the hedge fund manager. A server farm, registered to a shell company owned by Nathaniel Brooks. Brooks shot out of his chair clattering to the floor. "This is absurd. You've doctored these files." "The FBI Cyber Division is currently en route to that server farm, Nathaniel," Victoria stated flatly, checking her watch. "Jonathan called them 10 minutes before we walked through those doors. They'll find the VPN software, the dummy terminal, and the routing log pointing directly to your Geneva account." Panic erupted in the boardroom. Board members were shouting, pointing fingers at Patterson, who was now visibly shaking, looking frantically toward the exit. "This was a coup," Victoria said, raising her voice just enough to cut through the noise. The room quieted, captivated by the raw power radiating from her. "Gregory Patterson and Nathaniel Brooks conspired to drug me, steal $50 million from our R&D funds, frame me for embezzlement, and seize control of this company. They failed." She turned to Patterson, her gaze devoid of any mercy. "You're finished, Gregory. Security is waiting outside to escort you and Mr. Brooks to a private holding room until the federal authorities arrive. Your shares are forfeit under the corporate treason clause of your contract." Patterson opened his mouth to speak, to argue, to deny. But looking at the cold, hard data on the screen and the furious faces of the board, he knew he was dead. He slumped forward, the fight completely draining out of him. As security guards entered the boardroom to physically remove the two men, Jonathan Miller let out a breath he looked like he'd been holding for an hour. Victoria stood at the head of the table, fixing her cheap polyester cuffs. She surveyed the remaining board members, who were now staring at her with a mix of absolute terror and profound respect. "Now," Victoria said, her voice entirely devoid of the morning's chaos, returning to the calculating machine that had built the empire. "If there are no further motions for a vote of no confidence, we have a quarterly earnings report to discuss. And effective immediately, Thomas Hayes is promoted to Chief Risk Officer." The promotion was not merely a title change, it was a seismic shift in Thomas Hayes's reality. Within 48 hours of the explosive boardroom confrontation, his life had fundamentally transformed. He traded his cramped, windowless cubicle for a sweeping corner office on the 42nd floor of the Kensington Tower, complete with panoramic views of the Manhattan skyline. His new compensation package as Chief Risk Officer instantly wiped out the crushing medical debt his late wife had left behind. For the first time in 3 years, Thomas looked at his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, and didn't feel a suffocating wave of financial panic about her future. But Thomas was a risk analyst down to his marrow. He was trained to look for the hidden fault lines, the structural weaknesses that others ignored. And while the corporate world and the Wall Street Journal celebrated Gregory Patterson's dramatic downfall, painting Victoria as a besieged but triumphant corporate queen, Thomas couldn't stop staring at the post-mortem cyber report. Something about the $50 million heist felt off. Sitting at his new mahogany desk after midnight, Thomas pulled up the decrypted routing logs provided by UBS, the private Swiss bank where the stolen funds had briefly landed before federal agents froze the account. Patterson and Nathaniel Brooks were currently sitting in federal holding cells, taking the fall. The narrative was neat and tidy, too tidy. Thomas traced the digital path of the money. It had moved from the Kensington R&D vault, through a maze of dummy corporations, and into the numbered UBS account in Geneva. But as Thomas applied a deep packet inspection algorithm to the logs, a microscopic anomaly flagged red on his screen. It was a pre-authorization ping. A digital handshake verifying the receiver account was active. The ping was dated Tuesday. The corporate gala and Patterson's subsequent theft happened on Thursday. Patterson couldn't have set up the receiving account on Tuesday. The R&D vault required a highly classified routing key to even accept external transfers, a key that changed weekly. Patterson, as COO, didn't have access to that tier of financial encryption. Only 2 people in the entire Kensington Empire possessed the master routing key: Victoria Kensington and the Chief Financial Officer, Jonathan Miller. Thomas's blood ran cold. He pulled up the IP address of the Tuesday ping. It originated from a secure, encrypted Wi-Fi network at the Little Nell, a luxury 5-star hotel in Aspen, Colorado. Fingers flying across his keyboard, Thomas cross-referenced the corporate travel and expense database. There it was. Jonathan Miller had expensed a 3-day executive retreat to the Little Nell earlier that week. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. Patterson wasn't the mastermind. He was the attack dog. Jonathan Miller had wanted the CEO position for years, but lacked the board's favor to launch a direct coup. So, Jonathan quietly supplied Patterson's brother-in-law in IT with the exploit to bypass Victoria's RFID token. He handed Patterson the loaded gun, knowing Patterson's ambition would compel him to pull the trigger. Jonathan's plan was brilliant and ruthless. He would let Patterson steal the $50 million and frame Victoria. Once Victoria was ousted and Patterson was inevitably caught by the FBI's cyber division, a trail Jonathan had deliberately left open, the board would turn to the only remaining, untainted senior executive to lead the company: Jonathan Miller. And as a bonus, Jonathan had hidden a backdoor in the UBS account to siphon off $10 million for himself before the feds froze it. Thomas didn't wait until morning. He printed the logs, shoved them into a manila folder, and called Victoria's private security detail. 20 minutes later, Thomas stepped out of a private elevator and into Victoria's triplex penthouse. The contrast to his Maplewood home was staggering. The penthouse was a museum of modern art and cold, minimalist luxury, bathed in the glow of the city below. Victoria was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, wearing a silk robe, a stark departure from the target suit she had weaponized days earlier. She took the folder from Thomas without a word, her sharp eyes scanning the highlighted lines of code and the Aspen hotel receipts. As she read, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The betrayal of her COO was business. The betrayal of her CFO, a man her father had mentored, was deeply personal. "Jonathan," she whispered, her voice laced with a lethal, quiet fury. He was the one calling me in a panic yesterday morning. He was managing the crisis, pushing me to produce an alibi, knowing exactly what had happened. He played everyone, Miss Kensington, and he's coming to the office tomorrow, expecting to be appointed interim CEO in Patterson's wake. Victoria closed the folder and walked over to a crystal decanter, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid. She handed one to Thomas. "No, he isn't. We aren't waiting until tomorrow. Call him. Tell him I've discovered a secondary breach in the Cayman accounts, and I need him here immediately. It's time to close the trap." At 2 a.m., Jonathan Miller stepped off the elevator into the penthouse, looking perfectly disheveled to play the part of the dedicated, overworked CFO. "Victoria, I came as soon as I got the call from Hayes. What secondary breach? I thought we locked the system down." Jonathan stopped dead in his tracks. Victoria was sitting in a plush leather armchair, her legs crossed, sipping her drink. Standing beside her, leaning against the marble fireplace, was Thomas Hayes. And standing in the shadows near the entryway were 2 federal agents from the FBI's white-collar crime division. "There is no secondary breach, Jonathan," Victoria said smoothly. "But there was a rather interesting pre-authorization ping sent to UBS from your suite at the Little Nell." Jonathan's face drained of color. The practiced mask of loyalty shattered, replaced by the cornered panic of a man watching his life evaporate. He looked at Thomas, recognizing exactly who had dug his grave. "You're a numbers guy, Hayes," Jonathan stammered, stepping backward. "You know how this works. She's a tyrant. She was driving the stock into the ground. I was trying to save the company. You were trying to steal $10 million and the CEO's chair while letting Gregory Patterson take the collateral damage," Thomas corrected, his voice steady. "The math doesn't add up, Jonathan. It never did." Victoria gestured to the agents, who stepped forward and read Jonathan his rights, cuffing his hands behind his back. The penthouse was entirely silent as the elevator doors closed, taking the last of the traitors away. Victoria let out a long, exhausted sigh, rubbing her temples. The empire was safe, but the cost had been steep. She looked at Thomas, the quiet, unassuming widower from New Jersey who had single-handedly dismantled a $50 million conspiracy and saved her legacy twice in 1 week. "I suppose a simple thank you is severely inadequate at this point, Mr. Hayes," she said softly. "You gave me the CRO position, Miss Kensington. We're more than even." 3 days later, Thomas was in his kitchen in Maplewood, burning pancakes for Lily, when the doorbell rang. He opened it to find a delivery courier holding a sleek, black garment box emblazoned with the Kensington Global Holdings logo. Thomas brought it inside and opened it on the dining table. Inside, resting on a bed of black tissue paper, was his faded blue flannel shirt. It had been professionally dry-cleaned, pressed, and folded with military precision. Resting on top of the shirt was a handwritten note on heavy, embossed cardstock. "Thomas, keep the shirt. You wear the armor better than anyone I know. Take Lily to Disney World this weekend. The corporate jet is waiting at Teterboro. V." Thomas smiled, looking from the note to his daughter, who was happily coloring a dinosaur at the table. The storm had passed. The villains were behind bars, and for the first time in a very long time, the future looked remarkably bright. The corporate world is a snake pit, but sometimes the quiet guy in the corner is the only one who can see the venom. Thomas and Victoria proved that loyalty and sharp data beat dirty money every time. Did this billionaire boardroom drama keep you on the edge of your seat? Hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe for more real-life thriller stories.